The water cycle shows the continuous movement of water within the Earth and the atmosphere. So the system includes many different processes where liquid water evaporates into water vapor, which is going to be gaseous, and then it's going to go ahead and condense and form clouds, which then allow precipitation to fall back to Earth. Water on the surface of Earth can also be found in solid forms like ice and snow. And then added to this image is also the idea of this tree here to show and represent transpiration. For this, trees are going to access groundwater via their roots. They're going to pull up that water for photosynthesis, and then it leaves through the stomata because of the process of transpiration. So that process of transpiration can be stopped when trees are cut down. On the left, you see this picture of a beautiful cloud forest in Ecuador. Now, these trees transpire so much groundwater that when the water vapor goes ahead and condenses, it forms clouds directly over those trees. Then precipitation falls back right to those same trees again, and the transpiration happens in this cycle. But this water cycle can be broken by human logging. When not done with sustainable practices, that can lead to something known as desertification. When you cut all the trees down, that transpiration process stops and you no longer have the rain that you once did. Why? Well, because you broke the water cycle. One of the most overlooked yet very valuable cycles is the phosphorus cycle. Now, living things need this element, phosphorus, to build structures like our cell membranes and our DNA and ATP. Phosphorus can naturally enter waterways through the settling of atmospheric precipitation and dust, like we see here, to the ocean floor. Also through glacial runoffs, or underground hydrothermal volcanic activity, or the natural process where organic materials are broken down through decay. So phosphate compounds in the soil can be taken up by plants, right? They can actually be absorbed. And from there, with food chains, you can transfer that to the animals that eat the plants. And then when the plants and the animals excrete waste or die, the phosphates can be taken up, again, in this idea of the detrivores and returned to the soil. Phosphorus enters the ecosystem through dissolved phosphorus from normal weathering of rocks. And those rocks contain the phosphorus, and these phosphorus-containing compounds are again carried in the surface runoff to rivers, surface runoff here, to rivers, like I said, and oceans, where they are then taken up by aquatic organisms. So it can then be processed by some extent by microorganisms like diatoms. But this cycle is really slow compared to the other biogeochemical cycles like water and the other ones that we'll get to like carbon and nitrogen cycles. And the average phosphate ion can actually spend anywhere from 20,000 to 100,000 years in the ocean. So this cycle takes a lot of time. So although phosphorus is a chemical element that is found on Earth within geological materials, like we said, rock, and to some extent, it has to do with the rock cycle. It's a really slow cycle. And on top of that, the average continental crust only contains about 0.27% of phosphorus. So when you take that into account, that there's not a lot of it, and phosphorus itself is not recyclable like we might have for aluminum, right? That means that that element is in high demand because it is found in chemical fertilizers. And it's needed to drive human agricultural needs. and that demand has to be met through mining. So there are large phosphorus mines found in places like Florida and China and Australia. And here the mines are extracting phosphate ore from rock phosphate. But these mines also produce large amount of waste. That includes toxic metals and even radioactive elements. The mining and the beneficiation process, which is any process that improves the benefits of the economic value of the ore by removing extra minerals to result in a higher grade product or a more concentrated product, is more value, right? So both the mining and the processing of these phosphorus mines results in hazardous elements entering the environment. Mainly things like the soil. And it can get in the water, in the atmosphere, and then it can enter the food chain. That also becomes an issue of environmental justice, especially in the areas where these mines can be found. Plus, there are other environmental impacts of this mining, such as rock desertification, stripping forest floors of nutrients, loss of biodiversity, and the potential increase of landslides and even ground erosion in these lands that are mined. So people add phosphorus to their fertilizers to meet the needs of their agricultural demand. But this fertilizer is carried off in runoff, and then that can actually get into waterways. And when it gets into waterways, it can cause an excessive growth of algae or other microbes that were previously limited by that phosphorus. And that phenomenon can lead to a process called eutrophication. Now we're going to get into more detail later, but for now, let's just say that ultimately leads to a decrease of oxygen in the water. Regions of lakes and oceans that are depleted of oxygen due to a nutrient influx are going to be called dead zones. The number of dead zones has increased for several years, and more than 400 of these zones existed in 2008. One of the worst dead zones is off the coast of the United States in the Gulf of Mexico. And as you can see in this figure, dead zones are actually found in high areas of industrialization. So this dead zone off the coast of the Gulf of Mexico is because fertilizer runoff from the Mississippi River Basin created this dead zone, and it was actually over 8,463 square miles large. But if you look here, you can see dead zones off of the East Coast as well. And in 2011, New Jersey passed fertilizer laws that protected our environment, and they limited the amount of time and the amount and the place that fertilizers can be put down. So for example, in Princeton, you're not allowed to put down fertilizer in the winter months because the ground can be frozen, which would increase the amount of runoff, which would lead to an increase of eutrophication in our area. Go Princeton. So we are made of carbon. We eat carbon, and our civilization, right, our economics, our homes, our means of transport, they're all built on carbon. And carbon is the backbone of life on Earth. It allows us to build proteins, carbs, lipids, nucleic acids. So carbon from the atmosphere is going to go ahead and enter through carbon fixation from the Calvin cycle in photosynthesis of plants. And that's how it's going to enter the ecosystem. And then the animals are going to go ahead and eat the plants that have this organic carbon. The animals respire out carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, and that cycle between photosynthesis and respiration continue. Also, if an animal defecates, urinates, or dies, detrivores like fungi And heterotrophic microbes like bacteria will break down those products and release the carbon back into the soil. So the ocean also plays a major part in the carbon cycle. Overall, the ocean is called a carbon sink because it takes up more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than it gives up. Some of the carbon dioxide stays as dissolved gas, which can be mixed into water to form carbonic acid, and that can actually drop the pH of the ocean water. But also, some of it can be turned into other things. So photosynthesis by tiny marine plants called phytoplankton can carbon fix and turn the inorganic carbon dioxide into organic material like sugar. So several marine organisms can use carbon to make calcium carbonate, which is a building material of shells and skeletons. And then when those marine organisms die and their bodies fall to the bottom, it can lead to a buildup of sedimentation. So movement of carbon from the atmosphere to the lithosphere or rocks can begin also with rain. So atmospheric carbon can actually combine with water to again form this weak acid, carbonic acid, and that falls to the surface in this rain. And then that acid dissolves the rocks in a process called chemical weathering. This releases calcium and magnesium, potassium, and sodium ions previously locked up in the rocks. And then it can be picked up by this runoff from things like rivers, and these ions can be carried to the ocean, which means that the carbon cycle actually helps aid in other geochemical cycles too. Now, when dealing with this layer of sediments, heat and pressure can actually compress any type of mud, and the carbon over millions of years forms these sedimentary rocks like shale. And in special cases, when dead plant material actually build up, and it builds up faster than it can decay, layers of organic carbon can become this idea of fossil fuels. It can become oil, coal, or natural gas instead of that sedimentary rock. And then we can burn them with combustion, right, in the form of fossil fuels. So we need carbon, but that need is also entwined with one of the most serious problems facing us today, global climate change. Through this combustion, the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere has become huge. Before the Industrial Revolution, the levels of CO2 in the atmosphere were steady for thousands of years. But through the burning of fossil fuels, humans emit about 30 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. Now that's about 300 times more than something natural like a volcano would. So the Earth is doing its best. About 40% of the extra CO2 in the air is actually being absorbed. But what happens to the rest of the CO2? Well, it sits in the atmosphere. This excess CO2 holds on to, let me change my color here, holds on to more heat, trapping it in the atmosphere. And that drives up the average temperature. And that's what's causing global climate change. And that is the driving force that leads to global climate instability. For example, more extreme summers, more extreme droughts, more extreme forest fires, more extreme hurricanes, more extreme fluctuations, even in winter months. So the levels of carbon dioxide emissions have reached a tipping point, and new innovative ideas and sustainable practices need to be implemented, invented, and improved. Although 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas, this abundant abiotic reservoir exists in a form that is totally unusable by most organisms. only through a series of microbial transformations can this gaseous atmospheric nitrogen be made available in a usable organic form that allows the organisms to build vital biomolecules like proteins and nucleic acids. Now, the only biotic organism that can do this are nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They can either be free-living in the soil, or they can be found in association with certain plant roots in a symbiotic relationship. So these nitrogen-fixing bacteria have an enzyme called nitrogenase, which combines nitrogen atoms with hydrogen atoms. And ammonia is a nitrogen compound that can be dissolved in water. And it's actually easier for organisms and their enzymes to interact with. So interestingly enough, the enzyme nitrogenase is extremely sensitive to oxygen. So converting nitrogen to ammonia through that enzyme actually proceeds more efficiently in an anaerobic environment. Now, it can also happen in an aerobic environment like the soil, but it can become even more efficient in an anaerobic environment. So why is that important? That comes back to our picture here. So an example of an oxygen-free compartment is in this rhizobium nodule that you can see here. They're found on the roots of certain legume plants. That hard casing of these nodules keeps oxygen out of the pockets where their mutualistic rhizobium bacteria do their really valuable work of converting nitrogen gas into ammonia. And then they can efficiently perform nitrogen fixation. And you can again see all these little nodules here on as these visible little round lumps on the roots of this cowpea plant. So these nitrogen-fixing bacteria make nitrogen available for the plants to use. Now in nitrification, right here, there's a host of soil bacteria that go ahead and participate in turning the ammonia into these nitrates, the form of nitrogen that can be actually used by plants. And this requires, like I said before, a two-step process performed by two different types of bacteria. Now, these bacteria don't convert the ammonia into the nitrates out of the goodness of their heart. Rather, these are chemotrophs. So these chemotrophs obtain their energy from chemicals. By metabolizing nitrogen along with oxygen, they obtain energy to power their own life process. And the process can be thought of as a rough and much less efficient analog of cellular respiration. So these nitrates are the end product of a string of these bacterial reactions, right? And now we can go ahead and make that artificially because that's going to be the main ingredient of many soil fertilizers. And you can actually sometimes look at the bags and see that fertilizers are referred to as nitrate fertilizer. Because by pumping the soil full of those nitrates, you allow the plants to go ahead and assimilate, to pick up that nitrogen much more quickly, and then they can grow larger faster without being dependent on the rate at which the nitrogen-fixing bacteria can actually do their job. So in that assimilation, plants are taking up these nitrates into their roots, and then they use that nitrogen to make amino acids and nucleic acids from scratch. And then, of course, the animals are going to eat the plants, and they are able to make their own amino acids and their own nucleotides to build their proteins and their nucleic acids like DNA and RNA for their own cells. So if those plants die, if those animals die, if they defecate, urinate, then we can again go through this process of ammonification. And that again is performed by these soil bacteria, which will decompose the dead plants or the animals. And again, during that process, you're going to decompose, you're going to break down those amino acids and the nucleic acids that were in those living organisms, and the bacteria will basically recycle them back into these nitrates, which can then either once again be assimilated, and I'll get rid of that arrow just so you can see the word, or it can be picked up by something called denitrifying bacteria. And what those do is they can convert that nitrogen back into the gaseous form through a process called denitrification. And again, the cycle continues. There's a picture here of lightning because lightning can actually perform nitrogen fixation as well. But since we are in biology, this is not a biotic process, so we don't actually focus on that here. So ancient people learned that if they did not alternate the growing nitrogen-consuming crops with nitrogen-fixing crops, their farms would become fallow and unable to support growth. But today, like I mentioned before, we use chemical fertilizers, which are super rich in nitrogen compounds as their main ingredients. So we make the soil more fertile. But since many fertilizers are containing those nitrogen compounds, it can lead to an excess of nitrogen. So we have that excess of nitrogen. And then that can actually be carried off by water runoff, which can lead to that process that I mentioned before called eutrophication. So what is this? So eutrophication is characterized by the excessive plant and algae growth due to increased availability of one or more limiting nutrients. So what could those be? Nitrogen and phosphorus. Again, we're applying those to agricultural crops to make sure that they are growing more efficiently. And then when there is runoff, the excess of those is then carried into an aquatic ecosystem. So both the nitrogen and the phosphorus can enter. So this new influx of previously limited nutrients allow the plants and the algae to now have access to what was a limiting factor and it no longer is, so their populations now start to rise. In the short term, that sounds like a really great thing because what is the waste product of photosynthesis? More oxygen. So in the short term, that sounds like a really great thing. However, because these nutrients are so prolific, what ends up happening is you get more and more and more and more and more algae growing. And now only the ones on the top have access to sunlight and can photosynthesize. All the ones on the bottom here don't receive enough light, they die, and their little bodies float to the bottom. Now, in every healthy ecosystem, you've got detrivores and you've got microbes. These microbes will go ahead and do what they do, which is to break these down. And because you get more and more death because these plants are falling to the bottom, these microbes now have an unlimited supply of food. So what do? They end up increasing their populations. But you have to remember, these are heterotrophs and they perform cellular respiration. So when they do that, their need for cellular respiration increases the biological demand in this ecosystem for oxygen. And they start to consume the oxygen and they start to pull the oxygen out of the water for their own cellular respiration needs. Now, the lower dissolved oxygen levels in the water can actually lead to death by hypoxia, which is the lack of oxygen for other aquatic organisms like fish. And when they start to die and their bodies float to the bottom, that produces even more food, which can actually make the entire process happen faster and more extreme. And then you can get to massive fish death, which we can actually call fish kills. So This problem of eutrophication, which is driven by, again, runoff from farmland, can really lead to devastating consequences for aquatic ecosystems. And that is a wrap for geochemical cycles. That includes water, phosphorus cycle, the idea of carbon cycle, and finally, nitrogen cycle. Hope that's helpful.